going to introduce our speaker we're very excited about. Dr. Matthew Landrus teaches history and visual culture at the Rhode Island School of Design. With a specialization in the science of art, the focus of much of his work has been on Leonardo da Vinci. He has published 3 books on Leonardo and numerous scholarly articles addressing primarily the working methods and intellectual histories of the Renaissance and early modern artists and engineers. Starting with examinations of the preparatory marks on works of art, Dr. Landrus explains their practical, theoretical, and social context. He studied Leonardo with Professor Dario Cobi at the University of Louisville, after which he continued those studies with Professor Martin Kemp at the University of Oxford, where he earned a doctorate in art history in 2006. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Landrus.
Thank you for those kind words and inviting me to speak as well. I'd like to thank you, Krista Snyder, as well as Margaret Seifert and Linnell Morgan and Brooke Sloan for your assistance and for making the necessary arrangements for tonight's talk, and also would like to thank Mary Lynn for her support. I'm going to, instead of speaking extempore, I'd like to sort of stick to a bit of a script just for the sake of time, because this is already a bit long, but bear with me, I hope you don't mind the script. I'm honored to speak to you at the Frazier History Museum, especially because I have long admired Owsley Brown Frazier's philanthropic support of the community, and I'm also a fan of the museum, this particular museum. Above all, I enjoy this rare occasion to speak with fellow learners this evening about which I rarely can do. And I will address the topic of the present exhibition, that of Leonardo the Genius. I'll get my presentation tools out. So by focusing on 2 of his projects, the giant crossbow drawing around 1490 and the Last Supper fresco of 1495-98, I will outline Leonardo's methods for studying the forms and functions of his subjects, and thereby the means by which he earned a reputation as a kind of genius early in his career. How do we assess his contributions as a work of genius? If we look at the paintings he designed or to which he contributed, they're around 24, fewer than those of many of his contemporaries. Leonardo wrote that painting was a science because it involved a mental discourse with arithmetic, geometry, and with experience especially. He considered these designs his inventions and made possible by the particular ability to convey with the most appropriate forms and natural effects the meanings of their purposes and functions. And it's my reason for this particular title for your talk today. If we look at his notes and drawings, there are roughly 6,000 remaining, of approximately 24,000 that are believed to have been his original notes. These include studies for treatises on painting, nature, and engineering in 21 codices and collections. This is a collection several times larger than that of his most prolific contemporaries. In addition to his work as a painter, Leonardo's preoccupation with this body of work, his series of books and studies, also earned him praise for his ingenio, or innate talent, or his brilliance of mind, as it would be defined. Ingenio, an early version of our word for genius, was also the root word for ingegnere, or engineer, a skill for which Leonardo was hired as often as for that of painting. He was among other practical men, so-called practical men, in the region between central Italy and southern Germany, known for their scholarly and practical approaches to art, natural philosophy, and engineering. At this time, the modern term for art, which Germans such as Albrecht Dürer called Kunst, was developed as a philosophical reference to the Latin term ars, which means skill, method, technique. Kunst was derived from konen, which means to know, and the word for ability or craft. Leonardo was part of this, of the Greek and Roman ars tradition, based on skill or technique, though was also at the turning point arts that his contemporaries referred to as modern, wherein science, math, natural philosophy were studies for the painter, sculptor, architect, and engineer. He stated, quote, "Let no man who is not a mathematician read my principles," end quote, on a sheet of anatomical studies, which was a possible reference to Aristotle, who stated that, quote, "A man investigating principles cannot argue with one who denies their existence," end quote. The first principle of Leonardo's understanding of forms and functions of nature and art is the proportional assessment of pyramidal law. He believed that all forms of nature were governed by this universal principle of proportional expansion and diminution along a pyramidal trajectory. With regard to motion, he offered a pyramidal diagram, quote, as, quote, "proof that the proportion of time and movement together with speed made in the descending of heavy bodies is pyramidal in shape, because the aforesaid powers are pyramidal since they begin and proceed by increasing degrees in arithmetical proportion." Thanks to this pyramidal law, all forms should be appropriately balanced. Hence, Leonardo studied the center of gravity of birds for his treatise on flight and the center of gravity in the human body. At the center of the brain, the fluid-filled ventricle was considered the central fluid-filled ventricle, which would have been located sort of in this area here, was considered the common sense organ, which was responsible for receiving information as well as managing or governing the parts of our activities of the rest of our body. Leonardo studied the way in which this sensus communis was naturally located along the central axis of the body. He also studied the way in which the human form would pivot under the flying machine or glider, making diagrams to help visualize this pivot and the direction of the wind from all sides of the glider pilot. So balance is one of the more important principles that we'll be looking at in the next few examples. Thanks to pyramidal law, all forms should be also governed by general forms such as architectural geometry. In this case, we have the famous Vitruvian Man from around 1490, when he studied proportional properties in nature and tried to make sense of sort of universal law of all of it. The study, of course, is from Vitruvius' third book on architecture, that an architecturally accurate human form naturally fits within a circle and a square. Before Leonardo had done this, artist engineers like Teccola and Francesco di Giorgio also illustrated these in their treatises, just to show you the general interest at the time in the same kind of study. A form is also proportional to its force. The study of the forces of weights was known as statics. When studying complex nerve fibers, known as the bronchial plexus, at the right here, Leonardo developed a pyramidal structure with which to visualize the arrangement of the nerves, which he believed were similar to muscles in the early anatomical studies that he was doing. At this stage of his studies, he was more concerned with the proportional form and function of the muscles, writing on the folio that, quote, this demonstration is as necessary for good draftsmanship as the derivation of Latin words is for good grammarians, for he will draw badly the muscles of figures if he does not know what are the muscles which are the causes of their movements. Studying the reliability of linen on a winged surface on the top left, he also was trying to assess the best way of analyzing movement. And he notes that if this quote does not hold up to the test, then had nothing more to do with it. And it would probably have been used for a fan or something of that nature. 16 years later, he studied a lightweight rope and pulley system as a means of supporting a flying machine or glider laying here on the bottom left. In addition to forms of pyramidal law, balance, form, and force, Leonardo studied forms of movement and dynamics. Since he had no means to accurately calculate air or water friction, he also addressed the velocity of objects in air or water in a similar manner. In other words, he believed they had similar properties. Produced proportional analogies for both, and in order to look at dynamic problems. He usually explained dynamics, the study of objects in motion, with medieval impetus theory, which did not account for the air drag or viscous resistance. So he had a lot of mistakes in the study. So while making notes for treatises on paintings and on the nature of water in manuscript A, as shown on the right at center, he included a note on the impetus theory along with a diagram stating, quote, "How admirable is your justice, prime mover," that being God, "you have willed that no power lack the order and qualities of its necessary effects." In other words, the necessary effects that are stored within that object when it's thrown or upon its first movement. His illustration of the paths of a freely thrown ball and a bouncing ball has the ball stopping at different locations, though according to the impetus theory he quotes, they are supposed to reach the same distance because they have the same energy stored in them. But they don't, and he illustrates that in this diagram. 3 years later, in what is now called the Codex Madrid, he compared the motion of a bouncing ball with the undulating movement of waves of water, addressing fluid mechanics and impetus dynamics as if similar pyramidal laws of the appearance and proportional oscillations govern them. Rather than quantify speed or friction in this case, Leonardo was primarily interested in qualities of movement in air and water, using the proportional model as an analytical tool. Addressing the erosion of riverbanks, he offers an analysis here where he puts obstacles in the way of the water and then shows the way in which the crisscrossing of the water changes by virtue of the change in direction with the help of just a small change on the riverbank. So you're looking at small changes that make a big effect on turbulence. He used theories of proportional form, balance, and movement in technical projects and treatises, including especially his development of the giant crossbow. As part of his extensive treatise program, he illustrated the giant crossbow, and other giant siege engines in preparation for an updated version of Roberto Valturio's De Re Militari, a popular treatise on military engineering best known around 1490, an Italian and Latin edition published in Verona in 1483. Those are, as you can probably tell, on the left and the bottom center. Here we see the most elaborate of the siege engines in Valturio's treatise, that of the dragon cannon, as the grandest, most distracting example among the siege engines in Book 10 of Valturio's treatise. The dragon cannon is similar to the giant crossbow with a battening armature and a centerpiece of Leonardo's massive siege engine designs for a military treatise. At full scale, the giant crossbow armature would have had a width of 80 feet and a carriage length of 77 feet, whereas the large vertical crossbow or dart sniping catapult would be 22 feet tall by 12 feet wide. These appear to be much bigger than the examples in the comparable illustrations in Valturio's De Re Militari. These are other illustrations for Leonardo's updated version of De Re Militari, or rather, sort of an extreme version of the military treatise. A large bent frame catapult is at the top left, and a large repeating crossbow is at the bottom left. And a large vertical bent frame catapult with sling, called a trombola, is at the bottom right. What differentiates Leonardo's designs from those of his predecessors is that of the precision of these designs. Instead of using perspective construction for the overhead views, he drew dimetric axonometric projections that have relatively equal measurements in the foreground and background. For the first time in the history of engineering, the proportions for these projections are accurate on at least 2 of the 3 dimensions, and thus the engineer should have enough information with which to build one of these according to the proportions represented on paper. In most cases, these designs are at a 30, 60, 90 degree angle, and they are diametric because two of the directions of view are at the same scale. Note that they are not isometric, however, where in all three dimensions are at the same scale. The giant crossbow is a good example of the use of proportional design because its dimensions are discussed in the text at the right side of the sheet, which I sort of copy in English over here on the left. A comparison of the written dimensions with measurements of the drawing show that the crossbow width and length are at the same scale of 108 to 1, whereas the components at the side are somewhat larger at a scale of 80 to 1. In the statement at the right, Leonardo writes that the measurements in arms, he writes about the measurements in what's called braccia, or arm's lengths, so you'll hear me say braccia every now and then. They're 59 centimeters each. The crossbow opens at its arms, that is where the rope is attached, 42 braccia, and it is thickest, without its armature, 1 2/3 braccia, or arm lengths. And its thinnest, 2/3 of a braccia. It has an elevation or draw of 14 braccia. Its carriage is 2 braccia wide and 40 long, and it carries 100 pounds of stone. And when it is moving, the carriage lowers itself, and the crossbow directs itself along the length of the carriage. The upper carriage is in two portions of 2/3 of a braccia each, separated by a space of nearly 1/3 of a braccia, illustrated as 1.9 millimeters on the sheet of paper, if you take a ruler to the sheet of paper. Conveniently, 1/3 of a braccia is also the illustrated thickness of the wheel, the felloe, the hub, the spoke, the trigger, the braces, all of these items right in here. You can see this. Use my hand. All of these elements that are the sort of smallest modular portions are the one third of a braccia. Measurements of nearly all crossbow components on the drawing confirm that they proportionally fit one another, partially because they fit the portions that are measured in thirds. A measurement of the crossbow width at the back end of the carriage reveals an anomaly such that the 16.2 millimeter width that Leonardo refers to as 2 braccia equals a slightly larger scale of 72 to 1 right here. But this is the only example on the crossbow that is out of scale. Nonetheless, compared with leading engineering drawings of the time, such as those here by Francesco di Giorgio, trimetric illustrations in which all three dimensions are at different scales were the norm at the time and were not as accurate. They were just general illustrations that were not as accurate for the engineer to be as useful, for example. Here we see 3 preparatory drawings that illustrate the initial plan at the top left for the extension of the lower carriage beyond the armature. At the top, where you see the extension of the lower carriage beyond the armature just above it, and that adds to the stability. And then on the below here, you see then the trigger mechanism sketches illustrated, and at the top, an illustration of the basket that would hold the 100-pound ball. That looks like to be it's the right size anyway. And especially the brackets on the rope that would hold the rope stable as they were being attached to the basket. But he would abandon those brackets as a way of holding those ropes stable in the final illustration for the giant crossbow. The top preparatory drawing with the ratchet and pawl mechanisms useful for the winding screw mechanism on the crossbow is also a presentation drawing, likely for the De Re Militari treatise, in which Leonardo was perhaps characteristically planning to include details or sections of the main designs to better illustrate the ways in which the siege engine's components worked. The drawing below, with sketches of trigger mechanisms, demonstrates an initial interest in a quiet lever trigger mechanism, and then an interest in a hammer trigger mechanism as well. Before drawing with pen and ink, Leonardo prepared the sheet with fine lines, by incising fine lines into the sheet with a metal stylus and a ruler or a template, marking the positions of straight lines with a divider, or rather a compass, and marking the curved edges with the armature. These incisions are invisible to the naked eye, though one can see them by shining a bright light across the surface, a sort of raking light across the surface of the paper, casting slight shadows on the edges of these incisions. With white lines, I show here where I found the metal stylus incisions on the paper, which is covered with them. So there's a lot of information here about Leonardo's initial intentions for preparing the sheet. To make the armature, Leonardo used the crossed arc method such that he pivoted one end of the divider from the top of the sheet. This was originally two sheets attached, and then they were cut apart from each other. And with its opposite end, he would then make an arc with a compass at the bottom like this. Then he would repeat this step by pivoting the divider at the base of the divider, and then with the other divider make an arc across the top. This crossed arc method allows them for a 90-degree angle line to go between the two arcs, drawn from here to the other side, and avoids the necessity of having a 90-degree, it's a way of checking your 90-degree angle so that you have straight lines throughout your drawing. After this, he drew a 90-degree metal stylus incision across the crossed arcs, as we see here. And finding that this line was too high on the sheet, he repeated the crossed arc method in order to produce another metal stylus incision just below it from the ends of the bottom line. He drew the armature across some portions of the arc that are already marked, as you see here. On this bottom line, there's a hole in the paper, which I marked with a white dot, and the metal, and a line that extends across this line is at 60 degrees to the picture plane. So the reason for this I'll get to in a moment, but then he made most likely armature portions by way of pivoting the divider at these portions of the drawing and making portions of the armature which seem to match the arc of the divider. His interest in the dimensions of 1/3 proportions is related to the common use of those proportions by his contemporaries. And what he did here is he shifted the sheet by about 2%, or 2 degrees, showing that he didn't really have a full, he wasn't really worried about the measurements for these additional lines which are on the outside and below, as he was worried about the initial 60-degree angle of the carriage above. And in this case, you see a number of examples where he has used 1/3 proportions throughout. And this is an interest of himself and his contemporaries to make his engineering projects a bit easier. A way to demonstrate this interest in the rule of 3 is to show you the project for the water clock and bell ringer that he did several years later, around 1510. Hence we see here calculations of the widths of water reservoirs as a means of determining the rate of their release of water once an hour. The smallest tube of water with the number 1 for the first hour fills first, releases water, and thereby triggers the bell ringer. All of that is sort of illustrated right here. When the water is released from up here in one of these vessels, then it enters this cup, and that triggers the paddle that triggers the bell ringer. So he thought of arranging these vessels in one circular chamber compared to the natural arrangement of muscles he witnessed in the leg. He had to determine the proportional differences between cylinder diameters that increased in size from 1 unit wide to 24 units, as these would fill with water and drop on each successive hour, triggering a flow of water that would activate a mechanical bell ringer. Rather than follow the rule of 3, with mathematical precision, however, he added 1/3 to the diameter of each vessel, as his first calculation indicated that this would be relatively reliable. So instead of using, say, the modern irrational number of pi, which would be our calculation for volume, pi times radius of the cylinder squared times height, he understood that each vessel had the same height, so then he just added 1/3 to the diameter of each vessel, such that the area would be 1/3 times radius squared. And he substituted 3 for 22/7, or rather pi. In practice, he preferred geometrical and mechanical solutions to arithmetical problems. His reason for choosing the dimensions of 40 by 42 for the great crossbow may derive from this interest in the geometry of Euclid and Archimedes, which he studied with Frazier in the 1480s. The 60-degree angle of the carriage to the picture plane is 1/3 of 2 right angles, and 2/3 of 60 happens to be 40, the carriage length. Thus, the carriage as the side of the equilateral and equiangular triangle may compose an equiangular and equilateral hexagon, such that the sides of the hexagon would measure 40 units each. And if the hexagon is inscribed in a circle, the radius of that circle would measure 40 units as well. The crossbow's width of 42 braccia, or arm lengths, may derive from the Archimedes approximation of the number used to calculate the circumference of a circle, that being a fraction of 22/7 in rational numbers. By multiplying this diameter, this number by the diameter, that is, which is 80, he finds a circumference of 251 and 9/25 braccia. A sixth of this circumference is one section of an inscribed hexagon, which is 41 and 17/19, very close, of course, to 42, Leonardo's estimate. Did these numbers have any relation to the power or capability of the crossbow? Although he initially believed that distance of a projectile would be proportional to the draw strength of the crossbow's rope, he found that this did not work. Increasing the draw tension did not affect proportionally the distance of the projectile. The correction he considered in his writings about this was in the Madrid manuscript, wherein he added later notes toward the bottom here, where he puts in a parenthetical note stating that the angles formed by the string, as they are shot by the bow at various distances, are what governs the proportional distances of the object being thrown. So the angle is inversely proportional to the likely distance of an object thrown from it. If we look at the capability of the giant crossbow, it appears to be in the position to shoot a projectile at half the maximum distance of its design, so that it can be in two other positions other than the initial position that we see it in. Until recently, scholars referred to the giant crossbow drawing as merely paper engineering that was for Leonardo's own amusement. And Leonardo's specifications on the sheet were inaccurately translated by these scholars as well. Considering the diametric and proportional precision of the presentation drawing and the dozens of preparatory drawings for it, not to mention the other large-scale engine designs, Leonardo obviously intended for this work to be seen by fellow engineers, those who would wonder about the feasibility of building these machines to full scale. Most notably, Ludovico Sforza, as the ruler of Milan and a military engineer by virtue of his extensive military commissions, was the likely recipient of such a military treatise by this famous member of his court. Thus, the precision forms of the De Re Militari drawings were essential to their function, and which was to impress military engineers who were knowledgeable about their engineering treatises. This is all very new information. So, as it happens, one of the 4 royal armories, other than the present museum and those at Leeds at the Tower of London, the museum at Fort Nelson in Hampshire, England, was the initial owner of the full-scale construction of Leonardo's giant crossbow, which you see here. IT and Factual Television invested £100,000 in its construction in the summer of 2002, after which the Royal Armouries agreed to look after it. It was at that time in 2002 that they asked me whether this thing would work. And I said, conceivably, before they built it, it would work well. I should know that it didn't work after they built it. But they didn't build it exactly to Leonardo's plans. So anyway, now for something completely different. The function and purpose of this painting was for it to accompany monks in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, a place where the patron of the painting, Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, would dine on Tuesdays. Its form conveys a tragedy in a very direct manner that might have been obvious to members of the church and the Sforza court. The subject of an individual who announces that he will be betrayed by someone in the room, which means that he will be sacrificed for his efforts. Ludovico was in the process of preparing the church at this time as his final resting place when he hired Ludovico to paint the mural about personal sacrifice. Leonardo used the opportunity to show the ways in which painting was a science and thereby worthy of being considered a liberal art. The audience for the painting was not only the monks but also the court. In addition to his arguments about this in his notes for a treatise on painting around 1490, academics in Florence such as Marsilio Ficino, Agnolo Poliziano, and Girolamo Savonarola also wrote about the necessity of painting to be included among the liberal arts. With the Last Supper, Leonardo offers engagements with at least 5 of the 7 liberal arts, unless of course we count grammar and astronomy, using, and I'm sure some people can with this painting, as much work that they've done on it. Using rhetoric and logic to convey a tragedy, using geometry for the painting's perspective, grid plan, tapestry proportions, and group proportions, using arithmetic and numerical ratios in the painting, and using music in the form of diatonic intervals in the perspective, which I'm going to show. The painting is located on the north wall of the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. The wall on which it is located is similar to the size in the room right around the corner to my left. This room is 29 feet, and the painting within that space, the Last Supper, is 27.5 feet wide and 13 3/4 feet tall. The ratio of roughly 1 to 2 from height to length. The room to the left of me is, I think, 24 or 25 feet wide. So you get a good example in there of what this looks like. You cannot take photos in front of it, unless, of course, you happen to be Silvio Berlusconi or Dmitry Medvedev. We see here that the painting still serves a political purpose. On the opposite wall, a crucifixion scene includes the portraits of Ludovico Sforza with his wife Beatrice d'Este and his sons Francesco and Massimiliano. This painting was in the process of being completed when Leonardo was commissioned to paint the Last Supper. And then soon afterward, they were going to take it off the wall and put something else. It was an interesting time. Anyway, that painting suffered extensive damage due to Allied bombardment in 1943, whereas the last, as you can see that sort of in the top image, whereas the Last Supper was protected with reinforcement. No, wait a minute, you see that in the bottom image. What happened to crucifixion in the top image has the reinforcements of the surface of the Last Supper where it was protected. There is parallel symbolism between the crucifixion and the lunettes above the Last Supper. A reconstruction of the latter is here at the top, but that's not the original. Such that the family is represented at both ends of the refectory. It is more important to note here that the primary source for the story of the crucifixion is the biblical story of Luke, chapter 23, and I will note in a moment that the account of Luke was also used for Leonardo's Last Supper. As noted in the video in the presentation upstairs and on the DVD in the bookshop, the painting began to deteriorate soon after Leonardo painted it. This early 16th century copy at the bottom is closest to the original example. Less than half of Last Supper survives expansion and contraction of the wall that it's on due to the change in temperature and moisture on the other side of a relatively weak and badly constructed wall that was made with reclaimed materials was the leading contributor to the painting's deterioration as the wall expanded and contracted. One of the most compelling features of the painting is Leonardo's portrayal of emotional expressions. When we look at the Last Suppers he had seen in Florence before he went to Milan, the scenes include apostles who are sad or curious, but they are not angry, as in Leonardo's painting. Ghirlandario's figures respond to the initial statement from Jesus that one of them will betray him. Castagno's figures respond in a similar way, which may have seemed unnatural to Leonardo. That said, he initially sketched the scene that recalls Castagno's Last Supper with Judas on the other side of the table and the figures with similar reactions. Leonardo must have been impressed with this vivid, powerful expression of Castagno's scene, but he would later include Judas on the same side of the table as the other apostles. The main difference with Leonardo's painting is that each of the apostles react with a different emotion, and they are deeply disturbed by Christ's revelation. To the right are three stages of denial. Doubting Thomas pointing to heaven, doubting that such cruelty would originate from there, with St. James' nature, shocked and angry, and finally with Philip, perhaps the best preserved of the figures is Philip, in fact, of all the paintings, gesturing to himself as if to accept Christ's statement and to ask if the traitor is in fact himself. So, three stages of denial. This is sort of an Aristotelian tragedy that unfolds in both complex and unified ways involving anagnorisis, the recognition of one's own identity, and peripatia, the reversal of expectations. Every statement I've read about the painting's source notes that the apostles are responding to Christ's comment that, quote, one of you will betray me, end quote, such that the disciples, quote, looked at one another, end quote, and the source is normally linked to the book of John, chapter 13. This is not the reaction in Leonardo's painting, nor is it a sorrowful reaction noted in Matthew and Mark. The only extended reference to the Last Supper is in Luke, which recounts the event in the painting that follows a little after Leonardo's initial statement that one of the apostles will betray him. He notes that, quote, the hand that betrayeth me is with me on the table, end quote, and there was also strife among them, so he's portraying the strife that he sees among them. All of this activity, by way of a perspective layout and figural gestures on Christ, is directed to Christ, and more specifically to the point at Christ's right temple. Although the significance of this location has received little attention, it is an essential clue to the interpretation of the painting. Leonardo uses, in this case, a play on words, which he was also known to use with other paintings like Mona Lisa and the Ginevra da Vinci portraits. The Italian word for tempia at the side of the head is similar to the Italian word for tempio, which is a building for worship. These are both based on the proportions of the Vitruvian man. For Leonardo, the vanishing point was a significant reference to infinite distance. In the Last Supper, he points it toward the soul of Christ. The soul was generally believed to reside in the sensus communis at the center of the brain. Thus, the vanishing point points to the link to God, that being the soul, and at the center of the brain. And that being, of course, the infinite being that it points to. Christ's sensus communis is, and its link to God via the soul, thereby receives all of the sensory experiences in the refectory, and also it governs the sensory experiences in that room. So it receives and extends by way of this perspective diagram. Early in Leonardo's studies for the Last Supper, he considered the way in which the painting would fill the space in the upper portion of the wall. He etched outlines into the wall surface, and many of which are were visible during the restoration and are now a little bit painted over. And of course, he used his studies of Euclid's elements to map the space. The first steps of inscribing a circle with a hexagon are on the preparatory drawing for the Last Supper. And this approach is part of Eudoxus' method for the exhaustion of this is Eudoxus' method for method of exhaustion, which is also the method for squaring the circle. The basic principle is that the area of the circle is proportional to the square of its diameter. Impose this study on the space of the Last Supper refectory, and one sees the position of the painting on the wall. Of course, one has to consider where the floor is now compared to where the original floor is below it, the base of the floor. In the top image, you can see that the perspective arrangement for the painting extends to a point 24 braccia or arm lengths into the room, which is the illusionistic distance into the painting. The illusionistic depth of 24 braccia may be recognized in a series of coffers that are 6 across and 12 deep. Again, perfectly balanced. Some of these coffers are not visible under the architrave. As it happens, well, you don't see the architrave here, but it's right above the image that you're looking at the top. As it happens, the grid that Leonardo used to apply the drawing of the composition on the wall is at a ratio of 1:2, or 12 high by 24 across. I found these coffer and grid dimensions recently by looking at correspondences between the measurements and the newly restored painting and its composition. I also found a series of useful proportions, first by looking at the arrangement of the figures. The 4 groups of 3 figures each seem to form waves of activity, as if a stone is dropped in a pool and water rises at the center and waves form at the sides, with the flow of undercurrents visible with the hand gestures. You see that as I've added the points there. Each group is in a special zone on the grid. The 2 outer groups of 3 are in a zone extending between the 6th and 12th grid squares from the center. The next zone between the 4th and 6th squares from the center includes only Judas. You can see that. It's a kind of exclusion zone. Peter and John, as well as Thomas, James Major, and Philip, are in the next 2 zones, whereas Christ is in the central zone. So it seems to be a clever geometrical way of dividing up the figures. The groups are perfectly balanced numerically and geometrically, a major concern for Leonardo. The ratios of separation also correspond with the diatonic scale of an octave, a fifth, and a fourth, in ratios of 1:2, 2:3, and 3:4. The distance between the tapestries also correspond to this musical scale, so that the space recedes in a harmonic manner. The question often comes up, would anybody have understood such a harmonic procession of space? Members of the court might have. It's not necessarily just something of Leonardo's inside joke. Here we see the change in perspective proportions as the tapestries extend to the back of the room with harmonic proportions. So here you see that these harmonic proportions are not in proportion. They set a different type of spatial dynamic. So in conclusion, here we see the change in perspectival proportions. The conclusion that I would like to make then in this case is that these 2 works, that in the first case, the example from the De Re Militari treatise is a standard treatment of military strategy and engineering, and that drawing is specifically for a treatise program that Leonardo had worked on that included studies of anatomy, of mechanics, and natural forms in general that he had a large program for. The most complete version of which is the Codex Madrid. The proportional components of that drawing is what make it quite unusual and make it actually a useful drawing, something that he wanted to impress his clients with. The Last Supper, then, for the Duke of Milan, is as much of an operatic expression as he wanted to argue that painting was the superior art to that of sculpture and some of the other arts, and it was equal to music because it could portray music in the same way. So he's putting putting his argument to the test by painting this Last Supper. It's the only good example I can think of, where he shows that music can be portrayed in a visual expression. So to understand Leonardo's inventions and investigations requires an appreciation of his skills as an artist and engineer, a study of his design process and how his work was intended to function or appear. At issue are the proportional theories and methods common to both imaginative and technical projects. Leonardo's mastery of these approaches meant that he was in demand at leading courts in Italy and France. Central to his success had been his ability to express in visual terms the functions and meanings of drawings and paintings to bring them to life, so to speak. Thank you. I think that now more questions.
Wonderful. Does anyone have questions for Dr. Landrus? I'm going to kind of walk the mic around for you guys since we've got a packed house, so bear with me.
Really enjoyed that. How many of his mechanical drawings taken to scale would actually work, do you think? I mean, his giant bow there didn't work, I guess. How many was there a percentage that you ever got paid for?
I think that's something that needs to be done, or could be done, but it's just that it would cost so much. I think Leonardo was looking at a cost-saving method, actually, that did not use so much bronze, because for one thing, those big sports I had to give away all of his bronze that he was scheduled to use for his Sports a Horse project in honor of his father, Francesco's father. He gave that away in 1494 to expel the French. And so one of Leonardo's interests with his treatise would have been to bring back medieval designs and to make them buildable and of interest, but also to produce a treatise that was intellectual and far greater and far more fantastic than anything before it. And to bring you to the point of sort of disbelief, right? Even though what he was trying to prove, obviously, is that you could use the right illustrative methods to show that they were probably buildable. And yes, that should be tested. The giant crossbow was the first test of its kind for the giant projects. It's the only one in terms of percentages that was tested, but they didn't have enough money to work out the right armature design. And I argued for it at the time that they still invested so much, and the wheels were made of steel, so they invested a lot just in the wheels. But it's really in the armature they really should have invested. They built the armature twice, actually, in the process. They had an armature that the engineer they hired insisted that it be a modern armature, a modern sort of longbow type of style, not like Leonardo designed. And then they went back to the drawing board because that didn't work at all, it just broke. And they went back and they put together something that looked a lot more like Leonardo's, but with limited budget.
Of the designs that we see in this collection and in the others, what percentage would you say of his designs had the built-in flaws so that it would not work? In other words, he was obviously very concerned about someone taking the idea. Was that more the military aspects of things, or in what percentage would you say these things have a built-in intellectual property protection?
Right, that's a great question, because the tradition of the military treatise is such that the earliest ones involved impractical methods so that war would not be, or so that siege efforts would not be as easy to mount and easy to start. So in fact, early military treatises are purposely impractical, even though there are some practical elements on how to take care of the soldiers. In fact, the first 9 books of Turio's treatise is all about what to do with the infantry, and that's primarily based on Roman research. And so Leonardo was focused on the 10th book on siege engines, and it's a good question whether or not he really wanted considered these to be buildable, or in his own time wanted anyone to bother with building them. And maybe that's why he made them so large, because they would be too expensive to try to build. Too much of an investment.
He sold them to someone who wanted to build them, or at least that's the impression that was given. He sold them in order to make money. Was that just selling the design? Someone else was to build it, or he was commissioned to also build it in hopes of building that?
He did indeed sell his expertise and sold drawings and other plans for military rulers, and he had to be genuine in that approach and give them the right types of designs or else. But the military treatise that he was producing for Ludovico Sforza could be a bit of both. It could be so outlandish that it was too expensive to follow, but yet followed up on the Turio tradition in a dramatic way. So yes, most of his life really he was hired as an engineer. One can see that more than as a painter. That's one of the reasons he was distracted from painting so long. If that answers your question. Yes.
Any other questions?
This may be a good question, but what's your theory on the very night of the
What's my theory? That John was John. Well, there's John being an angelic kind of young man is actually a desirable trait and a very nice trait to have in those days. And so this ambiguity of sexuality was not looked upon in the way that we might. It was looked upon as aristocratic as well as angelic. Was also rare because you probably didn't survive very well. You had to have great needs in order to be so angelic. And you showed yourself to be. And this is one of the primary arguments about nudity in Renaissance art as well. Is that when you see nude sculptures, according to some scholars, you're looking at an aristocratic model of this ambiguity and sexuality, as opposed to what we might think as more of a sexual statement, for example. So it's a complicated answer, I guess. But Mary Magdalene, no, I'm sorry.
One here back in the back.
I would like to follow. Do you have any information given to the official where did he gain his engineering experience? How did he come to a great mathematician?
Right. Where did he gain his engineering experience, and how did he become such a great mathematician or geometer? And it's a very good question because there's very little about that. Even though when you look at his notebooks, there are numerous occasions where he says, see Fazio for the Archimedes book, for example, as I referred to it today. He wanted to see various people for their books because they were not easy to come by, they were very expensive, and certain editions were at certain libraries only. And so he had the benefit of the Medici library in Florence when he worked briefly in the court of the Medici, and his father was a lawyer for the Medici, and so he had that access. And then at the Sforza court, he had access to that library in Milan, but also in Padua, and so he benefited a great deal from that access, looking at what engineers had done in their treatises, and also he visited engineers and was self-taught in that way. And from Fazio Cardano, he studied Euclid's books 1 through 5, and then on his own, it looks like he studied books 6 through 13, and was not really as much of a mathematician as he was a geometer. So in arithmetic, he had some training as a youngster and had gone to school to learn grammar, logic, and arithmetic in a primary school. Most likely he was put there by his father, even though he was an illegitimate child, just after he got to Florence, and then he was apprenticed at the Raffio studio at the age of 14 or 15, soon after grammar school.
All right, if you've got a question, put your hand up. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. The wonderful Frazier Museum volunteer Gary Serkey with a question. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
A little off point, but your thoughts on why we never finished the Mona Lisa, or was it finished?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Mona Lisa, supposedly he worked on it for 10 years after initially starting it in 1503. There are big questions about why he didn't give it back to the patron, and that's because it's likely he didn't think it was finished, and he would have spent anyway 2 or 3 years on such a painting, and yet it's believed generally that he kept it as a good example of his painting skills, and he could have worked on it more. I guess one could see him doing that, because he was always in the preparatory stages of his works. But that said, our idea of finished and his idea of finished are two very different things. You know, he would see it finished at different stages that he would have recognized it as something he could go back to, but something he was happy with, if that makes sense, because he kept it. So it's really just a matter of looking at possibilities. We don't really know.
Any other questions? All right, well, let's give Dr. Landrus a wonderful. This has been wonderful. We clearly had a lot of folks